السلام عليكم، معكم دانا أبو بكر من كلية طب الأسنان. إن شاء الله اليوم رح نكمل على Digestive Tract. رح نتكلم عن stomach and the esophagus. بس قبل ما نبلش خلينا نعمل a quick recap على the wall of the GI tract, which consists of the four main layers اللي هما الميكوزا, submucosa, muscularis and the serosa. So the mucosa is made up of three main structures اللي هما epithelial lining, lamina propria and the muscularis mucosa. The muscularis mucosa separates the mucosa from the submucosa, and it also allows movements of the mucosa, local movements of the mucosa. بعدين عندنا السبmucosa. السبmucosa contains denser connective tissue than that of the mucosa. It also has larger blood and lymph vessels. And في كمان بالسبmucosa المyoclonic plexus or the submucosal plexus. And the submucosal plexus controls the secretions from the mucosal and submucosal glands. Thirdly, عندنا muscularis, which is also called the Muscularis Externa. It's the thickest layer of the wall of the GI, and it contains the Auerbach nerve plexus or the myenteric nerve plexus, which controls the motility of the luminal contents of the GI. The enteric nervous system of the GI tract is composed of the myenteric nerve plexus and the myoclonic nerve plexus. And finally, عندنا serosa. Now the serosa is a sheet of loose connective tissue that's rich in blood vessels, lymphatics and adipose tissue. And لما يكون في عنا mesothelium بيكون اسمه serosa. لما ما يكون في mesothelium بتصير adventitia. And in the case of the absence of the mesothelium لما يكون في adventitia, the adventitia here بتكون a layer of connective tissue that's continuous with that of the surrounding tissues. السيروزا كمان في mesentery, which is a large fold of adipose connective tissue that's covered on by both sides of the mesothelium. That's covered on both sides by the mesothelium. So both sides of the mesentery is covered by mesothelium. وعندنا كمان الperitoneum, which is a serous membrane lining the abdominal cavity. Okay? So بس هيك يعني رؤوس أقلام just to refresh your memory. So عندنا الميكوزا, السبميكوزا, المسكularis and the serosa, with muscularis being the thickest. المهم هلا رح نبلش بمحاضرة اليوم. So أول شي رح نحكي عن الإسوفاجس. The esophagus is a muscular tube about 25 centimeters long in adults. So when it's fully developed بتكون about 25 centimeters long. And the main function of the esophagus is to transport swallowed materials from the pharynx to the stomach. The four layers of the GI tract اللي حكينا عنهم هلا first become well established and clearly seen in the esophagus. So you can clearly see them in the esophagus. وأول ما نشافوا بالesophagus. The esophageal mucosa is non-keratinized and it has stratified squamous epithelium. And the submucosa contains small mucus secreting glands اللي هما the esophageal glands. And these esophageal glands نفس ما حكينا هلا they secrete mucus. And the function of the mucus here is to lubricate and protect the mucosa. And it also facilitates the movement of food down the esophagus. وعندنا كمان towards the end of the esophagus near the stomach في كمان a group of glands اسمهم the esophageal cardiac glands, and these also secrete additional mucus. The muscularis mucosa of the esophagus is composed of one longitudinal muscle layer. Okay. A cross section of the esophagus, as you can see here, they're all you can clearly differentiate between the layers. هاي الlumen, directly lining the lumen عندنا الميكوزا, as you can see here, directly lining the lumen. بعدين عندنا submucosa. بعدين المسكularis, the thickest layer of the wall of the GI tract. بعدين finally عندنا الadventitia لأنه ما في mesothelium بالesophagus. هلأ في one part بالesophagus, I believe it's toward the end of the esophagus رح نشوف هلأ, and it contains serosa instead of an adventitia. هاي a magnification of the mucosa. As you can see here عندنا stratified squamous epithelium, بعدين تحته lamina propria, and finally the muscularis mucosa, which has scattered lymphocytes and strands of smooth muscle cells. Okay, so the swallowing begins voluntarily and ends involuntarily in the esophagus. Approximately the upper 1/3 of the esophagus في عنا skeletal muscle in the muscularis. بعدين the middle portion of the esophagus في skeletal and smooth muscle fibers, so a combination of skeletal and smooth. And finally towards the lower third في عنا smooth muscle. So the esophagus قسمناه ل 3 parts. The upper third في skeletal muscle نفس الtongue. بعدين بالنص في عنا skeletal and smooth muscle, combination of both. بعدين the lower third بس smooth muscle cells. So لما مثلا يجينا sections بنشوف إنه بس في smooth muscle نعرف إنه this is the lower third of the esophagus. لما يجينا بس skeletal نعرف إنه it's the upper third. لما يجينا a mix of both نعرف إنه it's the middle. Okay. هاي a longitudinal section of the esophagus. As you can see here عنا epithelium, lamina propria, muscularis mucosa. As you can see إنه بالmuscularis mucosa في عنا بس smooth muscle. So من خلال هيك رح نعرف إنه this is the lower third of the esophagus. هاي كمان a transverse section showing the muscularis. As you can see في عنا a mix of both the skeletal muscle and the smooth muscle fibers. Through that we can tell that this is a section of the middle of the esophagus. Okay. Only the distal 1 to 2 centimeters of the esophagus in the peritoneal cavity is covered by serosa, and the rest of the esophagus is enclosed by the loose connective tissue of the adventitia, which blends into the surrounding tissue. So, the esophagus essentially is fully covered by adventitia, but في عنا an exception. The distal 1 to 2 centimeters of the esophagus بالperitoneal cavity is covered by the serosa. So هاي الاسوفاجس بس هيك. هلا خلينا ننتقل ل the stomach. The stomach is a greatly dilated segment of the digestive tract. It's the most dilated segment of the digestive tract actually. And the stomach has a lot of functions but the main functions are firstly, to continue the digestion of carbohydrates initiated by the amylase of the saliva. As we know that the carbohydrates are first digested in the oral cavity because of the saliva containing amylase, بس ما بيكون full digestion, so the stomach continues that digestion. بعدين عنا to add an acidic fluid اللي هو hydrochloric acid to the ingested food and mixing its contents into a viscous mass called chyme. So chyme is food and hydrochloric acid mixed together, and they're mixed together by the churning activity of the muscularis. So the muscularis is responsible for mixing and churning the food with the hydrochloric acid to become chyme. Thirdly, the stomach begins the digestion of triglycerides by a secreted lipase, and finally to promote the initial digestion of proteins with the enzyme pepsin. Okay. السtomach فيه 4 major regions رح نتكلم عنهم هلا. الكارديا, الفندس, البودي and the pylorus. هاي هون as you can see عنا lesser curvature of the stomach and the greater curvature of the stomach. هاي الفندس. هاي الكارديا, and the cardia comes directly after the esophagus. هاي pylorus which extends into the small intestine, and هاي body of the stomach. Okay, so the cardia of the stomach is a narrow transitional zone. لما نحكي transitional zone يعني انتقالية, يعني من one to the other. So the cardia is a transitional zone between the esophagus and the stomach, and it's a narrow zone about 1.5 to 3 centimeters wide. بعدين عندنا pylorus, and the pylorus is the funnel-shaped region that opens into the small intestine. Both the cardia and the pylorus are primarily involved with mucus production, so they only produce mucus, and they are histologically similar. The much larger fundus and body, so the fundus and the body of the stomach are much larger than the pylorus and the cardia, and they are identical in microscopic structure, and they are the sites of gastric glands. So the fundus and the body are the sites of the secretion of acidic gastric juice from the gastric glands, and the mucosa and the submucosa of the empty stomach have large longitudinally directed folds called the rugae. في different pronunciations لهاي الكلمة, so I'm gonna go with rugae. And the rugae نفس ما حكينا هلا, they're longitudinal directed folds, and they flatten once the stomach is full, once the stomach fills with food. The wall in all regions of the stomach is made up of all 4 major layers اللي حكينا عنهم هلا, اللي هم الكارديا, الفندس, البودي and the pylorus. Okay, so the mucosa the mucosa changes abruptly at the esophagogastric junction. The esophagogastric junction is the point of meeting between the esophagus and the stomach. And زي ما احنا نعرف إن الesophagus فيه stratified squamous epithelium, while the stomach has a simple columnar epithelium, والchange هون ما بيصير gradually, it happens abruptly, it happens all of a sudden as you can see here. يعني هي ال stratified squamous epithelium, هي ال simple columnar epithelium, so هي ال esophagus, هي ال stomach, هي ال junction between the esophagus and the stomach, and as you can see here suddenly ال stratified epithelium بيصير columnar epithelium. So ما في gradual change, it happens all of a sudden. Okay, the invaginations form millions of the mucosal surface of the stomach is a simple columnar epithelium that invaginates deeply into the lamina propria. So the lamina propria فيها invaginations من the simple columnar epithelium of the stomach, and these invaginations form millions of gastric pits, each with an opening to the stomach lumen. The surface mucous cells that line the lumen and gastric pits, so the surface mucous cells that line the lumen and the gastric pits, secrete a thick, adherent, and highly viscous mucus layer. Okay, this mucus layer is rich in bicarbonate ions, and its function is to protect the mucosa from both the abrasive effects of the intraluminal food and the corrosive effects of the stomach acid. So the mucus layer, the highly viscous mucus layer اللي بتكون rich in bicarbonate ions, it protects the mucosa from the effects of the intraluminal food and the corrosive effects of the stomach acid, which is the hydrochloric acid. Okay, so the gastric pits lead to long branched tubular glands that extend through the full thickness of the lamina propria. ال gastric pits من كتر ما هم طوال تقسموا ل 3 parts, الاسthmus, the neck, and the base. They extend through the full thickness of the lamina propria. The stem cells for the epithelium lining the glands, the pits, and the stomach lumen are found in a narrow segment, اللي هي الاسthmus, between each gastric pit and the gastric glands. So the stem cells are found in the isthmus between each gastric pit and the gastric glands, and the pluripotent stem cells divide asymmetrically. So the stem cells divide asymmetrically, and they produce progenitor cells for all the other epithelial cells. Some of these move upwards to replace surface mucous cells, which have a turnover time of 4 to 7 days. So, the stem cells can be found in the isthmus, and they're found between each gastric pit and the gastric gland. They divide asymmetrically. They produce progenitor cells for all the other epithelial cells. So they replace any cell in the GI actually, and some of the cells move upward to replace the surface mucous cells, for example, and the surface mucous cells have a turnover time of 4 to 7 days. Another property of the stem cells is that it traps bicarbonates, thus maintaining the neutrality of the GI. هاي حكاها الدكتور مش موجودة بالكتاب, so it's good to know. Stem cells form tight junctions with nearby cells. So other progenitor cells migrate more deeply and differentiate into the secretory cells of the glands, and the turnover time of the secretory cells of the glands is slower than the surface mucous cells, so that they have a longer turnover time. The vascularized lamina propria surrounding and supporting the gastric pits and glands contains smooth muscle fibers, lymphoid cells, capillaries, and lymphatics. So the lamina propria here contains smooth muscle fibers, lymphoid cells, capillaries, and lymphatics. And كمان muscularis mucosa, which is composed of smooth muscle, and it separates the mucosa from the underlying submucosa. In the fundus and body, the gastric glands themselves fill most of the mucosa. So the mucosa of the fundus in the body is mostly filled with gastric glands, with several such glands formed by branching at the isthmus or the neck of each gastric pit. Secretory epithelial cells of the gastric glands are distributed unevenly and release products that are key to the stomach's functions. So secretory epithelial cells of the gastric glands are distributed evenly, 1, and 2, they release products that are key to the stomach's functions. هدول السيلز رح نتكلم عنهم هلا وعن their important functions, بس قبل ما نتكلم عنهم خلينا بس نشوف this picture, يعني just a quick summary على اللي رح نحكيه هلا. So هاي ال gastric pit هون, and the isthmus or the neck, and the gastric gland. So عنا surface mucous cells أول شي بالgastric pit, and it secretes alkaline fluid containing mucin, The alkaline fluid that it secretes protects the stomach from autodigestion. عندنا كمان mucous neck cells, and the mucous neck cells secrete acidic fluid containing mucin. عندنا كمان parietal cells, which secretes intrinsic factor and hydrochloric acid. Its main function is to secrete hydrochloric acid, and it also secretes intrinsic function and intrinsic factor, and the intrinsic factor is responsible for facilitating the absorption of vitamin B12. عندنا كمان chief cells, which secretes pepsinogen and gastric lipase, and finally عندنا the G cells, which is an enteroendocrine cell that secretes gastrin into the blood. So أول cell رح نحكي عنهم من those four major types is the mucous neck cell. The mucous neck cells are present mainly clustered, but they can also occur singly among the other cells in the neck of the gastric glands. So the mucous neck cells are mostly present as clusters, بس ممكن نلاقيهم as single cells, and they include many progenitor and immature surface mucous cells. The mucous neck cells are also less columnar than the surface mucous cells, which line the gastric pits, and the mucous neck cells are often distorted by neighboring cells, but they have a round nuclei and an apical secretory apical secretory granules. Because they have secretory granules at their apex, they have a basal nucleus. Their mucus secretion is less alkaline than that of the surface epithelial mucous cells. Okay? So, recap, mucous neck cells present mainly in clusters, can be found singular. They have many progenitor and immature surface mucous cells. They are less columnar. They have a round nucleus, which is basal, and they have apical secretory granules, and their secretion is less alkaline than that of the surface mucous cells. هلا رح نتكلم عن parietal cells or the exentic cells. And the parietal cells, مثل ما حكيت هلا, their main function is to produce hydrochloric acid. It also produces the intrinsic factor, which facilitates the absorption of vitamin B12, and they are present among the mucous neck cells and throughout the deeper parts of the gland. The parietal cells are large. They usually appear rounded or pyramidal, and because of how large they are, they have one and sometimes two central round nucleus. Their cytoplasm is intensely eosinophilic due to the high density of mitochondria. ففي بالparietal cell في كتير عنا large number of mitochondria, and a striking ultrastructural feature, so a very important feature, and it's exclusive to the parietal cell, is a deep circular invagination of the apical plasma membrane to form an intracellular canaliculus with a large surface area produced by thousands of microvilli. Okay, so a striking feature of the parietal cell, an active parietal cell, is a deep circular invagination of the apical plasma membrane to form an intracellular canaliculus with a large surface area produced by thousands of microvilli. So the microvilli increases the surface area of the cell. As shown in figure هلا رح نشوفها, the carbonic anhydrase catalyzes the conversion of cytoplasmic water and carbon dioxide into bicarbonate and hydrogen. So هلا خلينا نشوف قبل ما نشوف هاي, which is what will summarize the synthesis of hydrochloric acid, بس خلينا نشوف هاي. هلا هاي الرسمة shows the parietal cell divided into two. You can see the resting part of the cell and the active part of the cell. So once the cell is active, هيك بتكون ال components تبعها, and once it's inactive or resting, هيك بيكون ال components تبعها. So as you can see, the resting or the inactive parietal cell في عندها lesser mitochondria, and the active has more mitochondria. The active parietal cell في عندها lots of microvilli, and the resting might look like it doesn't have any microvilli, and this is because the tubular vesicles fuse with the cell membrane to form a large intercellular canaliculi and microvilli. So the tubular vesicles fuse with the cell membrane, forming microvilli, thus providing a generous increase in the surface of the cell membrane for diffusion and ion pumps. So بالresting part of the parietal cell, بالinactive phase of the parietal cell, ما في عنا microvilli because once the cell is stimulated لما يكون في activation the tubular vesicles will fuse with the cell membrane forming lots of microvilli. ونفس ما حكيت هلا المicrovilli provides a generous increase in the surface area of the cell membrane for diffusion and ion pumps. And prolonged activity may produce more mitochondria. So كل ما زادت الactivity كل ما كان في عنا mitochondria أكتر. Okay, so the resting cell in the resting cell a number of tubular vesicles اللي هم هدول are seen below the apical plasma membrane, but the cell has few microvilli and only short intracellular canaliculi. So in the resting phase of the parietal cell في عنا short intracellular canaliculi, and among the mitochondria and Golgi vesicles okay, so the intracellular canaliculi is among the mitochondria and Golgi vesicles. And when stimulated to produce the hydrochloric acid, the tubular vesicles نفس ما حكيت هلا they fuse with the cell membrane and they form microvilli to provide a large surface area for diffusion and ion pumps. Okay, and the more active, the more mitochondria. Okay, so هلا خلينا نشوف هاي الصورة. هلا هاي it summarizes the synthesis of the hydrochloric acid that is synthesized in the parietal cells. So أول إشي the water H2O within the parietal cell is split into a hydrogen ion and a hydroxide ion. So as you can see here, the water is split into hydrogen and hydroxide. Okay. بعدين the hydrogen ion is pumped into the lumen of the gastric gland by a hydrogen potassium pump. هاي lumen of the stomach, هاي parietal cell. Okay. And هاي blood vessels. أول شيء the water splits into hydrogen and hydroxide ion. The hydrogen is pumped into the lumen of the stomach by the hydrogen potassium pumps. بعدين the hydroxide ion bonds with the carbon dioxide and it forms a bicarbonate ion. The bicarbonate ion is moved towards the blood vessels where an exchange happens and a chloride ion enters the parietal cell. So an exchange occurs as the bicarbonate ion is transported out of the parietal cell. نفس ما حكينا هلا. So the bicarbonate ion is transported to the blood vessels. بيصير في عندنا exchange بدخل chloride ion على parietal cell and then the chloride enters the lumen of the stomach. Okay. Upon the entrance of the chloride ion, it bonds with the hydrogen ion that's in the lumen of the stomach forming hydrochloric acid. So خلينا نعيد. أول شيء الواتر اللي موجود بالparietal cell بتتقسم بتصير hydrogen ion بتصير hydroxide ion. الهيدروجين ion هاي is moved outside via the hydrogen potassium pump. Okay. And the hydroxide ion bonds with the carbon dioxide forming a bicarbonate ion. This bicarbonate ion moves out of the parietal cell into the blood vessels. بيصير في عنا exchange. The chloride ion enters the parietal cell and then it moves out of the parietal cell into the lumen of the stomach where it bonds with the hydrogen ion forming hydrochloric acid. Okay. So two things to note. أول إشي, the hydrochloric acid formation occurs in the lumen, not inside the cytoplasm of the parietal cell. So the hydrochloric acid synthesis happens in the lumen of the stomach, not inside the parietal cell. The second thing to note is that the bicarbonate is transported to blood vessels in large quantities, making blood more alkaline as it returns from the stomach after a meal. So البايكربونات اللي بيطلع من parietal cell to the blood vessels بيطلع in large quantities فبيخلي البلد more alkaline as it returns from the stomach after a meal. Okay. هلا في عنا medications that can inhibit and can lower the activity of the parietal cells موجودين عنا بكل بيت أكيد في منهم زي مثلا نيكسيوم زي منسك. الدكتور حكى اليوم إنه النيكسيوم موجود بكل البيوت إنه في كتير من هذا الدواء and this medication inhibits the activity of parietal cells therefore lowering the synthesis of hydrochloric acid. والناس اللي بيستخدموهم اللي بيكون عندهم حموضة بيعانوا من الحرقة and so on. Okay. So Parietal cells also secrete the intrinsic factor اللي حكينا عنهم هلا. The intrinsic factor is a glycoprotein required for the uptake of the vitamin B12 in the small intestine. Parietal cell secretory activity is stimulated both by the parasympathetic innervation and by the paracrine release of the histamine and the polypeptide gastrin from the enteroendocrine cells. So the intrinsic factor produced by the parietal cell is a glycoprotein, and it facilitates the absorption of vitamin B12 in the small intestine. The parietal cell secretory activity is stimulated by the parasympathetic innervation and by paracrine release of the histamine and the polypeptide gastrin اللي بيجي من الانتيرو cells. هلا رح نتكلم عن chief cells or the zymogenic cells. هدول they predominate the lower regions of the gastric glands, فبنشوف كتير منهم بالlower region of the gastric glands, and they have all the characteristics of the active protein secreting glands. Ultrastructurally, chief cells show abundant rough endoplasmic reticulum and numerous apical secretory granules, and because عندهم apical secretory granules, again عندهم a basal nuclei. The granules contain inactive enzyme pepsinogen, precursors which are converted in the acid environment of the stomach into active pepsin. أخذنا بالphysiology إنه pepsinogen is the inactive form of pepsin, and they're converted in the acid environment of the stomach into active pepsins. Pepsins are endoproteinases with broad specificity and maximal activity at the pH between 1.8 and 3.5. So the pepsin's optimal pH is acidic between 1.8 and 3.5. Pepsins initiate the hydrolysis of the ingested protein in the stomach. So the pepsin digests protein in the stomach, and the chief cells also produce gastric lipase, which digests many lipids. So the chief cells are responsible for the secretion of two. أول إشي البepsin, or it doesn't actually يعني secrete pepsin. It contains pepsinogen اللي بعدين بيصير pepsin لما يعني upon conversion in the acidic environment of the stomach. And the pepsin digests protein. وكمان chief cells produce gastric lipase which digests many. وهلا رح نتكلم عن آخر type of cells اللي بنحكي عنهم اللي هو enteroendocrine cells. These enteroendocrine cells are scattered epithelial cells in the gastric mucosa. They either have an endocrine or a paracrine function. بالفندس these small enteroendocrine cells secrete serotonin. The function that's important to us is that it stimulates gastric motility. It has other functions, but the one that's important to us is the gastric motility. And بالفندس the enteroendocrine cells are found at the basal lamina of the gastric glands. In the pylorus, however, the enteroendocrine cells are located in contact with the glandular lumens, and an example of that is the G cells, which produce the peptide gastrin, and gastrin increases hydrochloric acid secretion. Various enteroendocrine cells secrete different hormones, usually peptides, and are also found in the intestinal mucosa. We can find them بالفندس, بالpylorus, and the intestinal mucosa. And an example of the enteroendocrine cells that are found in the intestinal mucosa is enterochromaffin, argentophin cells, APUD cells, which are the amine precursor uptake and decarboxylation. وعندنا كمان the diffuse neuroendocrine system, which is the DNES. And upon stimulation, these cells release their hormone products that then exert either a paracrine effect, a local effect, or an endocrine effect, a systemic effect on the rest of the body via the vasculature. Cells of the digestive tract اللي هم DNES fall into two classes. So either عندنا a closed type of the DNES, or an open type of the DNES. The open type is when the constricted apical end of the cell contacts the lumen and bears chemoreceptors that sample the lumen's contents. And the closed type is when the cellular apex is covered by neighboring epithelial cells. So the DNES في two types, either a closed type بيكون the cellular apex covered by neighboring epithelial cells, وفي عنا open type لما the constricted apical end of the cell contacts the lumen, بصير في communication between the apical end of the cell and the lumen, و it bears chemoreceptors that sample the lumen's contents. Effects of these hormones include regulation of peristalsis and tract motility, secretion of digestive enzymes, water and electrolytes, and the sense of being satiated, يعني satisfied after eating. An example is leptin, an example of the hormone that makes you feel full after a meal is leptin. In the cardia and the pylorus regions of the stomach, the mucosa also contains tubular glands with long pits branching into coiled secretory portions called the cardiac glands and pyloric glands. So the cardiac and pyloric glands are the tubular glands which branch into coiled secretory portions. These glands lack both parietal cells and sheath cells, and they primarily secrete abundant mucus. So they secrete a lot of mucus, اللي هم cardiac and pyloric glands. Okay, so other layers of the stomach are السبميكوزا اللي هم the walls of the GI اللي بنعرفهم. أولا السبميكوزا which is composed of connective tissue with large blood and lymph vessels. وكمان السبميكوزا في عنده many lymphoid cells, macrophages and mast cells. المسكولاريس تبع الستومك في 3 poorly defined layers of the smooth muscle, it's ill defined, اللي هم the outer longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, and an innermost oblique layer. So the muscularis is ill developed. It has 3 layers: outer longitudinal, middle circular, and innermost oblique. The rhythmic contractions of the muscularis thoroughly mix ingested food and chyme with the mucus, hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes from the gastric mucosa. So the chyme is a mixture of food, mucus, hydrochloric acid and enzymes that's mixed by the action of the muscularis. And at the pylorus, the middle layer is greatly thickened to form the pyloric sphincter, and the stomach is covered by a thin serosa. So هاي end of this lecture. إن شاء الله next time رح نتكلم عن الintestine. I hope you guys benefited from this video. For any questions, feel free to contact me on Messenger. If anything isn't clear, you can always ask me on Messenger. Thank you for watching.